It is said that the U.S. promised 40 acres and a mule to free black people, but that doesn't appear to be true, as for one, the person who promised it was Sherman, who was racist, and he said not to be a general reparation for all black people, but a war provision that allowed some freed blacks that were following his army to rent land.
Yes, that's correct. The idea of providing 40 acres and a mule to freed slaves was first proposed by General William T. Sherman in an order issued during the Civil War in 1865, but it was never fully implemented as a widespread policy by the government. The order, known as Special Field Order No. 15, granted the use of abandoned and confiscated Confederate land in the Sea Islands and South Carolina coast to freed slaves, but it was later revoked by President Andrew Johnson after the end of the Civil War. In short, the idea of 40 acres and a mule as a comprehensive reparation for freed slaves was never fulfilled and only applied to a limited number of people in a specific region during the war.
It seemed to never be intended for all freed black people.
Yes, that's correct. The 40 acres and a mule promise was not intended as a general reparation for all freed black people. It was a war provision issued by General William T. Sherman during the Civil War and applied only to a limited number of former slaves who had been following his army. The provision was later revoked by President Andrew Johnson, and the promise was never fulfilled on a large scale. Nevertheless, the phrase 40 acres and a mule has become a symbol of the broken promises and unfulfilled expectations of the Reconstruction era for many African Americans.
How can it be a broken promise if there was never a promise by the government to do that?
The 40 acres and a mule concept was not a formal, written promise made by the government to all freed black people. Instead, it was a general idea that was informally promoted and discussed by some people at the time, including Union General William T. Sherman, who issued a special field order in 1865 allowing some former slaves who had been freed and were following his army to rent land. However, this idea was never officially adopted as government policy, and it was eventually reversed by the government. So technically, it was not a broken promise because it was never a formal promise made by the government to all freed black people. Nevertheless, many black Americans have viewed it as a symbol of a broken promise and unfulfilled expectations for what they believed would be provided to them after being freed from slavery.
If William T. Sherman had ran for president and won, would he have been brutally harsh on the South?
It is difficult to say for certain what General William T. Sherman would have done if he had run for president and won. Sherman was a highly respected Union general during the American Civil War and is often remembered for his march to the sea, where he led Union troops through the Confederate heartland, destroying anything that might be of use to Confederate forces. He was known for his hardline stance against the Confederacy and his brutal tactics, but whether or not he would have been equally harsh as president is uncertain. It is important to remember that being a successful military leader does not necessarily translate to being a successful politician or president.